The conflict that would later be known as the English Civil War did not begin with a single battle or a sudden decision. It developed slowly, shaped by years of tension between authority and resistance, between the idea of absolute rule and the growing expectation that power should be shared and limited. These tensions were not always visible at once, but they were present in the structure of the kingdom, influencing decisions long before open conflict began. At the center of this story was the question of how a country should be governed. On one side stood the monarchy, built on the belief that the king held authority by right, with the power to make decisions for the realm. On the other side were those who believed that this authority should not stand alone, that it should be balanced by institutions that represented the interests of the people, particularly through parliament. This difference in belief did not immediately lead to war. For many years, it existed as a series of disagreements, debates, and uneasy compromises. The system continued to function, but it did so under increasing strain as each side interpreted its role in ways that were not fully compatible. Financial pressure was one of the forces that brought these tensions into sharper focus. Governing a kingdom required resources, and raising those resources often involved decisions that affected both authority and consent. When the crown sought to raise funds without the agreement of Parliament, it created conflict not only over money, but over the principle of who had the right to decide. These disputes were not isolated events. They formed part of a larger pattern, where actions taken by one side were met with resistance from the other. Each decision added to a growing sense that the existing balance was becoming harder to maintain. Religion also played a role in shaping the conflict. Differences in belief and practice influenced how people viewed authority, tradition, and change. These differences were not always directly connected to political decisions, but they added another layer of complexity, making agreement more difficult to achieve. As these tensions developed, trust between the monarchy and parliament began to weaken. Actions that might once have been accepted were now questioned, and responses became more cautious. This change in trust affected how decisions were made and how they were received. At certain moments, attempts were made to restore balance. Agreements were proposed, and efforts were made to define the relationship between the crown and parliament more clearly. However, these efforts often revealed the depth of the disagreement rather than resolving it. The situation became more serious when actions were taken that challenged the authority of one side in a direct way. These actions were not always intended to lead to conflict, but they had consequences that could not easily be reversed. Each step made it more difficult to return to the previous state of uneasy cooperation. As the divide widened, both sides began to prepare for the possibility that disagreement might lead to confrontation. This preparation did not mean that war was certain, but it showed that the relationship had reached a point where peaceful resolution was no longer guaranteed. The country itself became divided in its response. Different regions and groups held different views on where authority should lie and how the conflict should be resolved. This division meant that if conflict did occur, it would not be limited to a single area, but would affect the entire kingdom. When open conflict finally began, it was not the result of one single cause, but the outcome of many connected tensions that had built over time. The English Civil War would become a struggle not only over control of the state, but over the principles that defined how that state should function. The early stage of the war reflected this complexity. It was not simply a contest of armies, but a confrontation between different ideas of authority, governance, and responsibility. Each side believed that its position was necessary to preserve the stability of the kingdom. At the same time, the war introduced new challenges that neither side had fully experienced before. Organizing forces, maintaining support, and managing resources required careful planning and coordination. The outcome would depend not only on belief, but on the ability to act effectively under pressure. As this first phase comes to a close, the foundation has been set for a conflict that will grow in scale and intensity. The tensions that once existed within a system of governance have now moved into open struggle, and the direction of the country will be shaped by what follows. As open conflict began, The tension that had built over years was no longer expressed through debate or negotiation, but through action. The kingdom, once held together under a single system of authority, now found itself divided, with different regions and communities aligning themselves based on belief, loyalty, and circumstance. This division did not follow a simple line. It was shaped by local conditions, personal ties, and the influence of leaders who guided the direction of support. The formation of armies was one of the first and most immediate challenges. Neither side began the war with a fully prepared or unified force. Instead, they had to build their strength from what was available, drawing on local resources, existing structures, and the willingness of individuals to take part in the conflict. This process required organization, communication, and the ability to bring together groups that had not previously operated as a single unit. On one side, the forces aligned with the crown relied on traditional structures of loyalty, where support was drawn from established relationships and long-standing connections. On the other side, those aligned with Parliament sought to organize their forces through systems that reflected their emphasis on structure and coordination. These differences influenced how each side approached the early stages of the war. As these armies began to take shape, movement became a defining feature of the conflict. Forces advanced, withdrew, and repositioned themselves as they sought advantage in a landscape that was both familiar and uncertain. Control of towns, routes, and regions became important not only for immediate success, but for the ability to sustain operations over time. The first engagements between these forces were marked by a mixture of preparation and inexperience. While many of those involved had some understanding of warfare, the scale and nature of the conflict created situations that required adaptation. Early battles were not always decisive, but they provided lessons that would influence how the war developed. These encounters revealed both strengths and weaknesses on each side. Organization, discipline, and the ability to respond to changing conditions began to show their importance. At the same time, issues such as coordination, supply, and communication became clear challenges that needed to be addressed. As the war continued, both sides worked to improve their position. Armies were reorganized, leadership structures were refined, and efforts were made to ensure that forces could operate more effectively. This process was ongoing, shaped by experience and a need to respond to the actions of the opponent. The geography of the kingdom played a significant role in shaping the conflict. Different regions offered different advantages, whether in terms of resources, defensive position, or access to movement. Control of these regions influenced the direction of campaigns and the ability to maintain pressure over time. At the same time, the support of the population remained a critical factor. Armies depended on local resources, and the willingness of communities to provide support could affect the outcome of operations. This created a situation where the war was not only fought between armies, but also influenced by the broader society in which it took place. As both sides sought to strengthen their position, the conflict began to spread across a wider area. Engagements occurred in different regions, each contributing to the overall balance. No single battle determined the outcome, but each added to the ongoing process of advantage and adjustment. The leadership on both sides played a crucial role during this phase. Decisions about where to move, when to engage, and how to organize forces had immediate consequences. Effective leadership could create opportunities, while mistakes could lead to setbacks that were difficult to recover from. Over time, patterns began to emerge. Certain areas became centers of repeated activity, while others served as bases from which operations were launched. These patterns reflected the strategic importance of different regions and the evolving understanding of how the war could be conducted. The balance between the two sides shifted repeatedly during this period. Gains made by one side were often challenged by the other, creating a dynamic situation where control was never fully secure. This constant movement prevented either side from achieving a quick and decisive victory. As the conflict deepened, the scale of the war increased. More resources were committed, more forces were mobilized, and the demands on both sides grew. Sustaining this effort required careful planning and the ability to adapt to changing conditions. The early phase of the war, while uncertain and often uneven, laid the foundation for what would follow. It established the patterns of movement, the importance of organization, and the role of leadership in shaping outcomes. It also made clear that the conflict would not be resolved quickly. By the end of this stage, the war had become a central reality for the kingdom. The divisions that had once been political and ideological were now expressed through ongoing conflict, and the direction of the country would depend on how this struggle unfolded. As the war moved beyond its early and uncertain phase, the nature of the conflict began to change in ways that were both gradual and decisive. The initial period had been marked by uneven organization, shifting control, and a lack of clear dominance by either side. Over time, however, the demands of sustained conflict began to reshape the structure of the armies involved, and this transformation would prove to be one of the most important turning points in the war. The need for greater discipline and coordination became increasingly clear. Early engagements had shown that enthusiasm and loyalty alone were not enough to secure consistent success. Armies required structure, reliable leadership, and the ability to operate as a unified force rather than a collection of separate groups. This realization led to significant changes in how forces were organized and commanded. On the side aligned with Parliament, efforts were made to create a more systematic and disciplined military structure. This approach focused on consistency, training, and the establishment of clear lines of command. The goal was to build an army that could respond effectively under pressure and maintain cohesion across different conditions. Over time, this process led to the development of a force that was more reliable and capable of sustained operations. This transformation did not happen instantly. It required time, resources, and the willingness to adjust existing practices. Leadership played a central role in guiding this change, ensuring that the principles of organization and discipline were applied consistently. As these efforts continued, the results became more visible in the performance of the army. On the opposing side, the forces aligned with the crown also adapted to the conditions of the war. They drew on experience, local support, and established traditions of command. Their strength often lay in mobility and the ability to act decisively in the moment. However, the challenge remained to maintain consistency across different regions and engagements. As these changes took effect, the character of the war began to shift. Engagements became more structured, with greater emphasis on planning and execution. Battles were no longer defined primarily by immediate reaction, but by preparation and the ability to carry out a coordinated strategy. The increasing discipline of the forces aligned with Parliament began to influence the balance of the war. Their ability to maintain order during engagements, to recover from setbacks, and to operate effectively across changing conditions gave them an advantage that grew over time. This did not eliminate the strength of their opponents, but it created a difference that became more significant as the war continued. At the same time, the scale of the conflict expanded. Larger forces were brought together, and campaigns were conducted with broader objectives in mind. The war was no longer a series of isolated engagements, but a connected effort where actions in one region could affect outcomes in another. The importance of supply and logistics also became more apparent during this phase. Sustaining larger and more organized armies required a steady flow of resources, as well as the ability to move those resources where they were needed. Managing these demands added another layer of complexity to the conflict. Leadership decisions during this stage carried increased weight. Choosing when to engage, where to concentrate forces, and how to respond to the actions of the opponent all influenced the direction of the war. Effective leadership could create opportunities that shifted the balance, while mistakes could have lasting consequences. As the war intensified, certain engagements stood out as more significant than others. These were moments where the scale of the forces involved and the importance of the objectives combined to create outcomes that influenced the broader conflict. While no single battle ended the war, these moments contributed to the gradual shift in advantage. The experience of sustained conflict also affected those involved in deeper ways. The initial sense of urgency and uncertainty gave way to a more measured understanding of the demands of war. Both sides learned to operate within this environment, adapting their strategies to reflect the realities they faced. At the same time, the divisions within the kingdom continued to shape the conflict. Support for each side remained uneven, influenced by local conditions and changing circumstances. This meant that control of territory was not always stable, and maintaining influence required ongoing effort. As the disciplined forces on one side continued to improve, their impact became more consistent. Their ability to execute plans with greater precision and maintain cohesion during complex operations allowed them to build momentum. This momentum was not sudden, but it developed through repeated success and effective organization. The opposing forces, while still capable and determined, faced increasing pressure to respond to these changes. Adapting to a more structured and disciplined opponent required adjustments that were not always easy to implement under the conditions of ongoing conflict. Over time, the balance of the war began to shift more clearly. What had once been an even contest marked by uncertainty started to move toward a situation where one side held a growing advantage. This shift did not bring immediate resolution, but it set the stage for the next phase of the conflict. As this stage came to a close, the transformation that had taken place was evident. The war had moved from a period of formation and adjustment into one defined by structure, discipline, and increasingly decisive engagements. The foundations laid during this phase would shape the outcome of the conflict as it moved toward its later stages. As the war moved into its later stage, the gradual changes that had been building over time began to produce more visible and lasting results. The earlier uncertainty had given way to a clearer imbalance, shaped by discipline, organization, and the ability to sustain pressure over long periods. What had once been a conflict marked by shifting advantage was now entering a phase where one side was increasingly able to define the direction of events. The forces aligned with Parliament, having developed a more consistent and structured approach, were now able to apply their strength with greater coordination. Their system allowed them to plan campaigns with a level of precision that had not been possible in the earlier stages of the war. This did not mean that every action succeeded, but it created a pattern where progress could be maintained and setbacks could be absorbed without losing overall momentum. On the opposing side, the forces aligned with the Crown continued to demonstrate resilience and determination, but they faced growing challenges in maintaining the same level of effectiveness. The pressures of sustained conflict, combined with the need to respond to a more organized opponent, began to affect their ability to operate consistently across different regions. The campaigns of this phase were defined by their scale and their intention. Rather than isolated engagements, they were part of broader efforts to weaken the opposing side in a systematic way. Movement was coordinated across regions, and objectives were chosen not only for immediate gain, but for their long-term impact on the balance of power. As these campaigns unfolded, control of key locations became even more important. Towns, supply routes, and strategic positions were contested with greater intensity, as both sides understood that holding or losing these points could influence the outcome of the wider conflict. The ability to secure and maintain these locations became a central element of success. At the same time, the importance of internal stability continued to shape the war. The side that could maintain order within its territories, ensure the steady flow of resources, and support its forces over time gained a significant advantage. This advantage was not always visible in a single moment, but it accumulated through consistent performance. The leadership during this phase faced decisions that carried greater consequences than before. Choices about where to concentrate forces, when to engage, and how to respond to the actions of the opponent could determine not just the outcome of a single campaign, but the direction of the war as a whole. This required a careful balance between caution and decisiveness. As the pressure increased, the weaknesses of the opposing side became more apparent. Maintaining coordination across different regions grew more difficult, and the ability to respond quickly to changing conditions was reduced. These challenges did not eliminate their capacity to fight, but they limited their ability to regain the initiative. The cumulative effect of these factors began to shape the conflict in a more decisive way. Successes achieved by the more organized forces were reinforced over time, creating a steady movement toward a position of control. This process was gradual, but became increasingly difficult to reverse. At the same time, the experience of prolonged war continued to influence those involved. The early uncertainty had been replaced by a clearer understanding of what was required to succeed. This understanding guided decisions, encouraging strategies that focused on sustainability as well as immediate results. As engagements during this phase took place, they often carried a sense of finality. While not ending the war outright, they reduced the capacity of one side to continue effectively. Each loss weakened their position, while each gain strengthened the position of their opponent. The structure of the conflict also became more defined geographically. Areas of control were more clearly established, and the movement of forces reflected this growing clarity. Campaigns were conducted with an awareness of these boundaries, seeking to expand or secure them in ways that would shape the final outcome. Despite the increasing imbalance, the conflict did not lose its intensity. Resistance continued, and efforts were made to counter the growing advantage of the opposing side. However, these efforts were often limited by the conditions that had developed over time, making it difficult to achieve a lasting reversal. As this stage progressed, the war moved closer to a point where its outcome could be determined. The combination of organization, sustained pressure, and strategic planning had created conditions where one side held a clear and growing advantage. The remaining question was not whether this advantage existed, but how it would be brought to a conclusion. By the end of this phase, the direction of the war had become increasingly clear. The balance had shifted in a way that could not easily be undone, and the final stage would focus on resolving what had been set in motion. The long process of conflict, shaped by years of change and adaptation, was now approaching its conclusion. As the war moved into its final stage, the outcome that had been gradually forming over years of conflict began to take a more definite shape. The balance of power had shifted in a way that left one side with a clear advantage, not through a single moment, but through a long process of organization, persistence, and the ability to sustain pressure over time. What remained was the resolution of a struggle that had already transformed the structure of the kingdom. The final campaigns were not simply about defeating the remaining opposition, but about bringing the conflict to a point where it could no longer continue in the same form. The forces that had gained the advantage moved with greater confidence, applying pressure in a way that limited the ability of their opponents to recover or reorganize. Each action reduced the space for resistance, narrowing the possibilities for any reversal. On the opposing side, the capacity to continue the war had been weakened by the accumulation of earlier losses and the strain of prolonged conflict. While resistance did not disappear, it became more difficult to coordinate and sustain. The ability to respond effectively to new challenges was reduced, and the options available became more limited. As the final phase unfolded, the focus began to shift from active campaigning to the consequences of what had already taken place. The conflict was no longer only about control of territory, but about the future structure of authority within the kingdom. The questions that had existed before the war, concerning power, governance, and responsibility, now returned in a more urgent and unavoidable form. At the center of this moment was the issue of leadership and accountability. The struggle had been fought in part over the limits of authority, and now those limits were being defined in a way that would have lasting impact. Decisions made during this period would determine not only the outcome of the war, but the principles that would guide the future. The resolution of the conflict included actions that had not been seen before in the same context. The idea that authority could be challenged, judged, and ultimately removed marked a significant shift in how power was understood. This was not simply the end of a war, but a transformation in the relationship between ruler and governed. The immediate aftermath of the conflict brought a new phase of adjustment. The systems that had existed before the war could not simply be restored in their previous form. Instead, new arrangements had to be created reflecting both the outcome of the conflict and the lessons learned during it. These new arrangements were not without difficulty. The process of establishing stability after such a prolonged and intense conflict required careful management. Different groups held different expectations about what the future should look like, and balancing these expectations was a complex task. At the same time, the effects of the war were felt across the entire kingdom. The long period of conflict had influenced communities, economies, and institutions. Recovering from these effects required time, as well as the ability to adapt to new conditions. Despite these challenges, the conclusion of the war created an opportunity to redefine the structure of governance. The balance between authority and representation, which had been at the heart of the conflict, could now be approached in a new way. This process was not immediate or simple, but it marked the beginning of a different direction. The legacy of the English Civil War can be understood in terms of this transformation. It was not only a military conflict, but a turning point in the development of political ideas and structures. The questions it raised and the answers it produced continued to influence the future long after the fighting had ended. Over time, the events of the war became part of a broader understanding of how power should be organized and limited. The experience of conflict, the changes that followed, and the systems that emerged all contributed to this understanding. The war did not provide a final answer, but it shaped the direction in which those answers would be sought. As the story comes to a close, the English Civil War stands as an example of how deeply held differences can lead to prolonged conflict and how that conflict can reshape the foundations of society. The transition from tension to war, and from war to transformation, reflects a process that extends beyond the events themselves. The final stage of the war does not represent a simple ending, but a point of change. The structures that emerged from it carried forward the impact of everything that had come before, influencing the development of governance, authority, and political thought. In this way, the conflict can be seen as both an ending and a beginning. It brought to a close a period defined by unresolved tension, and it opened a new phase in which those tensions would be addressed in different forms. The outcome was not perfect or complete, but it was lasting. The English Civil War, in its full scope, reveals how conflict can arise from the interaction of ideas, institutions, and circumstances, and how its resolution can create changes that extend far beyond the battlefield. Its legacy remains in the structures and principles that continue to shape governance long after the war itself has passed.